Hi, class. Welcome to the Gospel of Matthew. This is the second week, and we are talking about the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 1 and 2. Chapter 1 and 2 are generally known as the birth narrative of Jesus in the Gospel. And it's different than Luke's birth narrative. Now, I know we talked about this a little bit in the last lecture, but I wanted to kind of dive a little bit deeper as we begin the Gospel of Matthew in earnest. I hope you've already gathered by the readings that Saldarini is going to be looking at the Gospel of Matthew as a Jewish document, really, and he understands the community there in Antioch. And I agree with Saldarini that I think the Gospel of Matthew was probably written in Antioch there in Syria. And so it comes out of that community and a very Jewish community. And so there's not a strong differentiation for Matthew that his community is Gentile. And Saldarini is going to hammer that point throughout his book as we read through it. And especially this week, he's going to talk about the people, the crowds, Israel, and how those terminologies function within the Gospel of Matthew. So I want us to get deeply kind of ingrained in the cultural milieu of that produced the Gospel of Matthew, right? Both in the Jewish sense and in a Roman sense. And that's where Warren Carter, his work's going to be really important for us, because while Matthew and Empire, his book, is specifically it's kind of a post-colonial reading. It's mostly about Empire and Matthew. But he really talks about the Roman context. So there's at least two contexts, a Jewish context and a Roman context. A Jewish context is certainly going to be talked to about Saldarini. Carter is going to talk about the Roman context, but those aren't mutually exclusive. I would argue that both of those guys are right in the sense that Matthew is a very Jewish document. And so the kind of movement, the Jesus movement in Matthew, is a Jewish movement that engages with Gentiles. But the way Gentiles are engaged in the Gospel of Matthew is from a very Jewish standpoint. And so and we'll get into this later, while there is acceptance of Gentiles, it's a very kind of subdued acceptance, a reluctant acceptance even. And so, and that's what's happening with the Roman Empire. So you have this Jewish Christian community that's producing the Gospel of Matthew. And the things that they're struggling with, how to incorporate Gentiles or whether to incorporate Gentiles, how much of the law do you obey? Is there some that you don't have to obey? All that stuff is being negotiated in the Gospel of Matthew. But it's being put on to Jesus and his time frame. So they are interpreting Jesus and his time period from their own context. And so the things that Jesus is dealing with in the Gospel of Matthew, that's actually what Matthew's community is dealing with in their own time. And so they negotiate their own context through their understanding of Jesus. We do the exact same thing today. What Warren Carter does, the value that Carter does, it shows that context is a very Roman context. So these were Jewish Christians negotiating a very Roman context. So when you hear Gentiles in Matthew, think Roman, right? Because it's the Roman Empire. And it's in that context where we find the birth narrative in the Gospel of Matthew, which is fundamentally different than the birth narrative in Luke. And those are the only two birth narratives that we have in the New Testament. Mark doesn't have a birth narrative. Mark starts with the gospel of Jesus Christ, and he's going to get baptized, right? That's how the whole Gospel of Mark starts, as a very quick beginning, no birth narrative. The Gospel of John, the Word becoming flesh, that's not a birth narrative either. This idea that the Word wrapped itself around flesh, the Word became flesh, that is not a birth narrative. In Luke and Matthew, these are the only two birth narratives in the New Testament. And Matthew and Luke are fundamentally different. So what you have that both birth narratives have in Matthew and Luke is the genealogy of Jesus. Matthew's gospel starts with the genealogy right out of the gate. Um, the verse 1:1 says, an account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So Jesus the Messiah, Jesus the Christ. This is very Jewish context, right? But Messiah and Christ is a leader, an anointed leader of Israel. And as you read through Matthew, this anointed leader of Israel is in direct competition with or contrast to political leadership of its own time. So Herod would have been directly affected by this kind of conception of a Messiah. And it had huge implications for the Roman Empire. And this is where Saldarini and Carter will be real instrumental in helping us understand that. David Garland's commentary on Matthew is going to be helpful. I encourage you guys to look at other commentaries on Matthew, commentaries that are in a series tend to be better. Anchor Bible has a great commentary. Hermeneia is a good commentary series. Look at some of those. Sacrapagina is some other commentaries. But it's fine to look at those. And when you write your paper, you'll need to engage those kind of commentaries and articles. But for right now, just make sure you read Garland's work, because that's going to be a commentary that'll take us verse by verse as we get into the Gospel of Matthew. And I think it's a helpful commentary. I think it engages the text theologically. And if you're going to be a minister or a theologian, you're going to probably need to do that anyway. So it's a good commentary to dialogue with. Musa Duve's work is just fantastic. Musa is from Botswana. She got her PhD at Vanderbilt. She's an incredible New Testament scholar. In her feminist post-colonial interpretation of the Bible, she deals specifically with Matthew chapter 15, 21 through 28, which is the Syrophoenician woman. So these are the readings that we're going to be doing, and it's going to help us kind of get a good idea of the Gospel of Matthew. But let's kind of pull it all the way back to the birth narratives. So chapter 1 in Matthew is kind of divided from chapter 1, verses 1 through 17, which is the genealogy, and then Matthew chapter 1, verses 18 through 25, which is the actual birth of Jesus. Now, Luke does have a genealogy, and Luke certainly talks about the birth of Jesus, but it's in different orders, right? The Gospel of Luke does not start with a genealogy, and Matthew does, but Jesus' birth in Luke starts at the end of chapter 1, and it's interrupted by Mary's song and Elizabeth's song, and then the birth finally happens in chapter 2, verses 1 through 7 in Luke. So the birth narratives, while you both have a story about Jesus' birth, you both have a genealogy. Luke has some different information beyond that, and so does Matthew. And so there's all this other material that's unique to Matthew and Luke. And so this is the reason why we don't think Matthew had a copy of Luke in front of him when he's writing his gospel. And we don't think Luke had a copy of Matthew when he's writing his gospel, because of these birth narratives. They're just fundamentally different. And even though both of them have a genealogy, that genealogy is different. And while they both talk about Jesus' birth, the way they talk about it is different, fundamentally different. So pay real close attention to that. The genealogy in Luke is in chapter 3, verses 23 through 38. So if you want to kind of compare those genealogies, look at Luke and look at Matthew. And I think I've actually posted this online already so that you can see those side by side. And I've also done that with the birth of Jesus, Jesus' birth in Matthew versus Jesus' birth in Luke. And again, the birth narrative in Luke is interrupted by the Song of Mary and the Song of Elizabeth. Well, then there's these things that are specific to Matthew, and that's the story of the wise men. Only Matthew talks about the wise men from the east seeing the star. And they come from the east, and they come to Herod, asking to see the King of the Jews, that the star had revealed to them that the King of the Jews was born. Well, Herod was the king of the Jews, and he didn't have any sons born at that time. So you can imagine how politically charged that would have been, right? And the Gospel of Matthew is very clear that this is a politically charged enterprise. And it goes from that story of the wise men coming to Herod. The very next section is Herod's plan to annihilate all the children, which is the image that you saw in last week's lecture. The slaughter of the innocents is devastating. But then, Herod has a plan to kind of wipe away all these kids so that he doesn't have a rival to his throne. And Herod is absolutely a puppet to the Roman Empire. The Romans institute Herod. Romans supported Herod. Herod was a Roman guy. He was. They even argued about whether he was Jewish or not, right? He was an Idumean. But he was certainly from that area, but he was there because the Romans put him there. So he's totally in bed with the Romans. And then at the end, when Herod tries to kill everybody, Joseph, they go to Egypt. They make a flight to Egypt, and there, after being there for a couple of years, it's revealed to Joseph that it's okay for him to come back. And they come back, and they don't go back to Bethlehem. They actually go to Nazareth. So the story is fundamentally different here. There are no shepherds in Matthew. That's Luke's story. There is no flight to Egypt in Luke. That's Matthew's story. Herod is barely present in the story of Jesus' birth there. In Matthew, the angel of the Lord appears to Joseph and tells Joseph that Mary's going to be impregnated by the Holy Spirit. In Matthew, the angel Gabriel comes to Mary and speaks to Mary directly. So you have a named angel in Luke. You don't have a named angel in Matthew. In Matthew, it goes to Joseph. In Luke, Gabriel goes to Mary. So those are fundamentally different kind of narratives. And because they're so different, we don't think Matthew and Luke knew each other. And so they operated independently. Now, later on, we'll see that they absolutely had a copy of the Gospel of Mark with them. That's a part of that story, that they had a common source. They actually had two common sources. But Mark is the common source. And we'll pick that up in the Gospel of Matthew, I think in chapter 4, when we get into Jesus' baptism. That is actually in all four. That's in all of the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And that's where Luke and Matthew begin to use Mark as a source. And not long after that, we'll see how Matthew and Luke are using another source that's not in Mark. But that other source that they're using in common is what we call the Q source. I think we've already talked about that, so I won't have to go back all over again through the synoptic problem. Now, the biggest thing right now is to recognize that the birth narrative in Matthew is fundamentally different than the birth narrative in Luke. And large sections of it is unique only to Matthew. It's not in anywhere else. And that's the story of the wise men, the story of Herod killing the innocents, and their escape to Egypt and their return from Egypt, the Holy Family, Joseph, Mary, and Jesus. So pay real close attention to that. As you read through this text, pay attention to the political name. Like when they use political leaders like Herod, and when they talk about Jesus in the genealogy as the son of David, that means that he is like the king of Israel. He's in the line of kings, and that that would put him in opposition to political leaders of his own time. Now, whether Jesus understood that about Jesus' own self or not is one thing, but by the time Matthew's writing this gospel, and he's writing it from Antioch in Syria, they absolutely believe that. And that's why they're kind of writing this letter, to show that they are different than the Roman Empire. That they are not just different, but even have animosity towards the Roman Empire. But they don't have animosity just towards the Roman Empire. They have animosity to even their own leaders, right? And so they're constructing Jesus as a political leader. And this is where Warren Carter's work is really important to show how the paterfamilias, the emperor and the emperor's family, how that political entity functioned within the Roman Empire. Carter shows that the way Matthew's constructing Jesus here is constructing a leader in opposition to the Roman Empire. Salderini does a good job to show how Jewish that actually is. So be very careful in the reading of the genealogies. Lay Matthew and Luke over against each other when you read the genealogy. Notice that the genealogy comes first in Matthew, so that is a very powerful statement to put Jesus in a genealogy of major leaders in the history of Israel, and understanding Jesus as something that God is doing to transform everything and create a new way forward in that Roman environment. So pay real close attention to that genealogy. Look at, please, you got to read Carter and Salderini. A lot of your quizzes are going to come from that. Your midterm and final will be almost exclusively those two. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email, and I'll try to be as attentive as I can be. But read the Gospel of Matthew. Read the Gospel of Matthew, and read Garland, Salderini, and Carter to fill you in here. And again, any questions, just send me an email.